members of NATO, and there's people that think that NATO is the cause of us being in war abroad, sending planes to the Middle East and all that, Afghanistan and Yugoslavia, and usually the United Nations was considered the peacekeeping forces, but now we have shifted all our resources to NATO, and we have in the United Nations Peace Corps like 60 soldiers or something, as compared to 3,000 or 4,000 in the 60s and 70s. So do you think that this affiliation with NATO should stop, or are you happy with it?
I think it should continue. I think Canada should continue to be part of NATO, but we should be a good influence on NATO. We should be working from inside to say NATO has a military mandate, but it also has a humanitarian mandate. And let's remember the great liberal traditions, the Pearsonian traditions of peacekeeping and so on, and have NATO look to diplomacy and peacekeeping as the first steps, and humanitarian assistance as one of the first steps. And military intervention should always be the last step, and it's a sign of failure. It's a sign that diplomacy and negotiation and humanitarian help has failed. And Canada has a tradition, a proud tradition of playing a role, a leadership role on the international stage, up until the time that Stephen Harper became our Prime Minister. And at that point, we seem to have shifted. And there's no war that Stephen Harper hasn't loved and jumped into and sent our troops into. And I think that that's a very dangerous approach for Canada. And Jean Chrétien's approach on the Iraq War was the right one. He said, as you say, let's look at the United Nations, see what the United Nations is saying. The United Nations concluded that the evidence for justifying the Iraq War was not there, and Canada stayed out, which was very good for Canadian soldiers and sailors and Air Force members. So I think we need to pay attention to what the United Nations says, as you said, but we also need to be a good influence inside NATO.
You think NATO will work for peace?
It needs countries like Norway, which is renowned around the world as a peacekeeping nation. And it needs the old Canada, the peacekeeping Canada, to come back and play a strong role in NATO. And if we have countries like that at the heart of NATO, holding back maybe some of the other countries, then that's a good role for Canada and Norway and other peace-loving countries.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Well, I'm not sure we should withdraw, Pedro, but I do think we need to take a look at our position within NATO and see if it does match up with our 3 points of what we're looking for in terms of disaster relief and defense. And so I think we have to evaluate our position in NATO. I don't believe it's necessary to withdraw, but I do think it is time to evaluate.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Now, some people think that NATO is actually undermining the peace work of the United Nations. And when the United Nations say no to a project, NATO say, here we go anyway, with or without United Nations approval. So when we are part of NATO, are we undermining the work of peace of United Nations?
Well, I think where we undermine the work of the United Nations is when we go into interventions abroad which are approved neither by the United Nations nor NATO. The Conservatives have taken us into conflicts without the approval of either one. And so this following the United States into combat missions like we've done in Iraq, I think, are the problem. And so it's a much bigger question than whether Canada belongs to NATO or not. It's whether we get Canada back to that very strong tradition we've always had of peacekeeping, and whether we can play a role on the international stage by trying to get resolution to these conflicts without the use of armed force.
So I hear you saying that it's okay to continue being affiliated with NATO.
Canada is a member of NATO, and certainly the nature of NATO has changed over time, and I don't think that that's our biggest problem right now. Our biggest problem is the Conservatives leading into conflicts which are not sanctioned by any of our international partners.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I believe that Canada should immediately withdraw our affiliation with NATO and with NORAD, and that these sorts of pacts damage our sovereignty and take away our ability to make our own independent policy choices. Canada needs an independent foreign policy based on peace and disarmament. Not only that, but when we see these big military budgets abroad, it damages democracy at home. This is exactly why we see, like, Bill C-51, for example, coming home to roost. This is a result of our policies abroad.
Our position as a Green Party MP, we'd be looking at more affiliation with the United Nations and bringing forth peacekeeping, again, back to that being the good ambassador, being peacekeepers of this country. I mean, you could travel anywhere with a Canadian flag on your backpack for many, many years and feel very proud of that. And it wasn't until recently that we have to start watching our backs. So we really want to see us return to being valued in our international community as peacekeepers, as the people who do make a change for the community as a whole, because we are a global community now, and we want to be known as the party that represents peace.
So would you advocate for Canada withdrawing from NATO?
That one I can't answer.
If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Now polling.ca.
Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.